What is the ELP? Well, almost the first thing that everybody says about it, who's trying to answer that question, is that it has 3 obligatory components. If it doesn't have these 3 obligatory components, it won't correspond to the principles and guidelines. It has a language passport, and that is intended to be like a real passport, in the sense that it provides a summary overview of the owner's linguistic identity and language learning and intercultural experience. Crucially, at its centre is a gradually accumulated record of the learner's self-assessment in the second and foreign languages that he or she knows. The idea then is that anyone who is working with an ELP and who shows this passport to another person will be giving that person a summary insight into his or her language learning and intercultural experience and identity. But the passport on its own would not get us very far. And behind the passport we have the language biography, which provides a reflective accompaniment to the ongoing processes of learning and using second languages and engaging with the cultures associated with them. To the extent that there is a process behind the European language portfolio, that process is driven by the language biography. And then there is a dossier, which in most cases is simply an open form into which ELP owners put evidence of their second language proficiency, their intercultural experience, and in some pedagogical contexts also work in progress. The European language portfolio is intended to serve 2 functions. A pedagogical function. It's designed to make the language learning process more transparent to the learner, and in that and other related ways to foster the development of learner autonomy. Now, this function is to be associated historically with the Council of Europe's long-term commitment to education for democratic citizenship and lifelong learning. If you want to educate people to be useful democratic citizens, you've got to help them to develop the skills of reflective self-management. And they've got to be able to think critically about the situations in which they are. They've got to be able to think critically about themselves and the skills that they can bring to bear on that situation. And that helps to explain why, through the 1970s in particular, the Council of Europe was so thoroughly engaged with new tendencies in adult education that were moving in that direction. The idea of learner autonomy is also, of course, to be associated with notions of lifelong learning, because an autonomous learner, among other things, is one who is self-motivated, self-driven, who is self-managing, who knows how to learn. We're constantly told, to continue learning through our lives. But of course, because we have to live those lives, we can't spend all our lives at school. And then the ELP has a reporting function. It's intended to provide practical evidence, gathering around this ongoing self-assessment, of the owner's second language proficiency and intercultural experience. And the reporting function is continuous with the Council of Europe's interest going way back to the early 1970s in developing ways of making language qualifications transparent across national boundaries, so that someone with a qualification in, let us say, German from France could somehow translate that into a set of statements that would make it comprehensible in, say, Spain or Italy or the United Kingdom. The enthusiasm of the Council of Europe to develop a unit credit system was unfortunately not widely shared, and it wasn't brought, therefore, to any successful conclusion. In a way, the European language portfolio seeks to achieve the same effect through the back door. Key features of the portfolio: it's designed to promote plurilingualism and pluriculturalism. These are the terms that the Council of Europe has adopted to designate those properties of individuals who know two or more languages or are involved in, have competence in, two or more cultures, used in distinction to multiculturalism, multilingualism, which are properties not of individuals but of societies. The ELP values all language and intercultural learning, whether it takes place in formal educational contexts or outside them. Many years ago, in his book Deschooling Society, Ivan Illich proposed that in those relatively rare situations where adults show that they're able to communicate in more languages than simply their mother tongue, it happens through either societal pressures, the need to do so in order to earn a living or whatever, or through accidents of biography, for example, falling in love with and marrying someone whose mother tongue is different from your own. The message he was attempting to communicate was, when people do succeed in learning second and foreign languages, generally speaking, school has nothing to do with it. I'm not sure that he was wrong. The third key feature, and this is a really important one, is that the self-assessment in the portfolio is carried out against the metric of the common reference levels of the common European framework. And so we need just to remind ourselves how those common reference levels are structured. The Common European Framework defines communicative proficiency at 6 levels arranged in 3 bands. So A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2. And of course, there are all kinds of difficulties in getting people to understand that simple scheme. One of the objections I've run into repeatedly in Ireland is, but you can't call beginners A. The framework also defines communicative proficiency in relation to 5 skills. The receptive skills of listening and reading, and then the 3 productive skills: spoken interaction, spoken production, and writing. Spoken interaction is, of course, reciprocal communication by speech between 2 or more people. Spoken production, not in my view a happy phrase in English, is what I'm engaged on at the moment. It's not a happy phrase because people coming to it, and I don't mean non-native speakers, I mean native speakers of English, look at spoken production and think it must have to do with pronunciation, accent, and that kind of thing, articulation. And then writing, which is writing. And it defines proficiency at these levels in relation to these skills in the first instance in terms of can-do statements, what the language learner and user can do. So the summary of the scheme looks like that. And you have on the horizontal axis across the top of the screen the 6 levels, and on the vertical axis you have the 5 skills. Now, I'm not stupid enough to imagine that you can read that, but if we home in on B1 spoken interaction, you can probably read that. So in each of these cells, which you can quickly work out there are 30, there are summary descriptions of what the learner can do at this level, like this one. I can deal with most situations likely to arise whilst travelling in an area where the language is spoken. I can enter unprepared into conversation on topics that are familiar, of personal interest, or pertinent to everyday life, for example, family, hobbies, work, travel, and current events. Now note, that's halfway up the 6-point scale. Think what Europe would be like if the average school leaver could do that in 2 languages. I've already spoken of the way in which the language biography is a sort of engine that drives teaching and learning behind, but always feeding into, the language passport. And in the Cercle ELP, that's the European Confederation of Language Centres in Higher Education, which we designed in Dublin, those descriptors are the checklist of, as it were, sub-activities or sub-skills which we devised by way of expanding on the summary you've just been looking at. So I can readily handle conversations on most topics that are familiar or of personal interest with generally appropriate use of register. I can sustain an extended conversational discussion, but may sometimes need a little help in communicating my thoughts. I can take part in routine formal discussion on familiar subjects in my academic or professional field if it's conducted in clearly articulated speech in standard dialect, and so on. But you can understand then how this provides a sort of map across which learners gradually move. And in this version of the ELP, you have those 4 cells to the right of each descriptor. And what you're meant to do in there is not tick, but write dates when you decide it's a goal and when you decide on self-assessment that you're achieving different levels of proficiency.